Hi, this is Bob Stilker. Really glad to be joining you today on one of our first experiments with Facebook and Facebook Live. The idea is that this is the first of a series of 30-minute Facebook Live events that we'll be doing. So let me begin. Some of you know me, some of you have seen me around. Let me begin by talking a little bit about my background, where I've come from, and why I'm here. Basically, I've spent my life working in and for community, helping people figure out what kind of a future they want, thinking together about what it is that we can do collectively that we can't do apart. For 25 years, most of that work was here in Spokane, Washington, my home. I was the co-founder and executive director of a community development nonprofit corporation that had some strange ideas that said the best way to develop community, whether it's planning or building housing or working with work-family relations, is to set up situations where people get to listen to each other, get to speak with each other and tell the truth. And it's a powerful body of work, but one of the things that I became aware of by the time the last century was coming to an end is the work that we were doing at Northwest Regional Facilitators was helping individual people have better lives, but we weren't doing anything that was shifting the underlying conditions that required people to need help if they were going to have better lives. And so the question of what makes enough of a difference to make a difference really started animating me. And by the beginning of this century, that sent me off to, well, first of all, that was when New Stories was founded, was in 2000. And one of the first things that we did was we moved into a partnership with the Berkana Institute. And in that partnership over the next 10 years, most of my own time was spent working with people in communities in the global south, in Pakistan and India and Zimbabwe and South Africa and Brazil and Mexico, where people were building community with what they had rather than really complaining about what they didn't. And that was pretty transformative, changed my views of leadership, helped me really understand how important dialogue was, and helped me see what the principles were that we knew to work from if we were going to build healthy and resilient communities. In 2009, I was invited to bring that work into Japan. Japan has been the culture of my heart since the early 70s when I went there as a college student. For 40 years, I had no interest in doing any work in Japan. It was a place I went for my own retreat, for my own get away from it. But in 2009, there was this clear invitation to bring what we were learning at New Stories and at Berkana into Japan. And I just leapt into that invitation. It felt right. 2010 ended up being this incredible year. Lots of things got born in Japan at that time, including art of hosting, including future centers, including a surge in going from one transition town to 7 transition towns, the translation of Theory U, and some initial work with social presence in theater. The Process Work Center in Japan took some big leaps forward. The year ended and a year started, and on March 11th, 2011, the triple disasters hit. This 9.0 earthquake in the Northeast, followed 45 minutes later by a tsunami that was rushing in at 50 miles an hour with waves going up to 60 feet. And then the next day, the nuclear reactors started to explode at Fukushima. Many of us look back after the disasters, and what we said is like Spirit gave us a head start. The connections that were made, the work that was started in 2010, for so many of us became the foundation that we built the work that we would do after the disasters on. And for me, the next 5 years through 2016 was primarily spent working in Japan, both working in the disaster area, helping people come together, listen to each other, grieve, talk, dream, plan, and get going. You know, one of the things that people in Japan figured out very quickly was that government can't take care of this. It's going to take all of us. And there's that Japanese proverb expression that the nail that sticks up gets pounded down. Well, 3/11 proved that to be untrue. And what started happening is people all across Japan started standing up for what was important to them. And the remarkable thing, or the notable thing, is that when they stood up, they continued to stand together. And that energy of standing up and standing together is the energy I know we need all over this planet right now. In the United States, we've been, pretty good at standing up for a long time, but our capacity to stand together after we've stood up, or to stay together, hasn't been that strong. And that's one of the things that we need to work on here. While I was in Japan during that period, one of the things that that helped me stay sane was I started writing blogs. I started writing about what I was seeing, what I was noticing, and what I was doing. And as those blogs started coming out 2 or 3 times a week, I had a sense that they'd eventually become a book. Didn't know quite what it would be, but just a sense. And by 2013 or 14, AG Press in Tokyo invited me to write that book. It was published in Japanese in 2015. The way it works in Japan is that the editor decides, the publisher and the editor decide what the title will be, which scared me. And I needn't be scared, because after the book was translated, the editorial team sat down and read the book and then did this deep discernment about, so what is this book really about? And their conclusion was that it's not about disaster. It's not about community building. It's about, what do we do when we can't see the future? And that became the title. I knew there'd be an English edition. I knew it would be different. I didn't know how different. And it took until about 7 months ago for the English edition to be published. And the English edition, I knew that, when we cannot see the future, where do we begin, was a little bit long for some people. So the English title became AfterNow, then : when we cannot see the future, where do we begin? And you can check out more about the book at www.afternow.today. The inquiry that I've been in for the last 6 months or so after the publication of the English edition has been around how to bring what we've learned in Japan, what we're learning in Japan, here into the United States. And that's what I want to mostly talk about today. It's really interesting. I've started in November doing some work with Simone Putnik, our executive director at News Stories. We've been working in Napa and Sonoma after the fires. And what working means is that mostly we've been showing up as a listening presence, inviting people to reflect on what they've been seeing, what they've been doing, what they've been learning through their work, and then doing different convening that's brought people together to do the same thing. And I've also been in conversations, and I made a couple trips to Japan so far this year, and I've been in conversation with colleagues there about, so, okay, it's been 7 years, and what's really happened? What's shifted? What's changed? And what we've said in the Japan context is that, well, frankly, if we look out at the sort of what we can see physically, Things have been rebuilt, things have been restored, but not a hell of a lot has changed. So the dream that some of us had, that the disasters were a point of release and an invitation for something new to come in, maybe not so much. And what's that about? Remember, I'll go back to Japan, or I'm back in Japan, so I'll stay there for a second. I always remember a convening that we came close to canceling in April of 2011. It was a convening of people to help design a future session program for 2011. And we almost canceled it because it was really rough. The emotional climate in Japan was staggering, is the best word I can think of. But we said, no, it's actually more important. It's more important now than it ever was. And we went ahead. 35, 40 people came. They came because they're Japanese and they said they'd come. And so they came. No one wanted to be there. As people came in, their focus on their shoe tips was extreme. It's like they were walking through molasses. I don't know if I have anything to say. I don't know if I can say anything. I don't know if I can listen to what anyone else has to say. But I said I'd be here. 3 hours later, the room was waka waka, which is Japanese for just excitement. And I'm just kind of going, what the hell? What happened? What happened in this 3 hours? And I had to back off into a corner and just quiet myself down. And this big voice comes streaming into my head, and it says, "We have been released from a future we did not want." And that was the opportunity that many of us saw. And earlier this year, as we looked back, it's kind of like, not so much. But then what we said is that, and actually, what's really significant is what's going on just beneath the surface. That people's mindset has changed. Their sense of what's important to them in their life has shifted. Their willingness to step towards something unknown has increased. And so under the surface, there's this shift, there's this change, but it's not very visible. It's visible in some ways, in some places, but mostly it's not very visible. And it reminded me of an expression that Willis Harman from the Institute of Noetic Sciences used to have. And Willis talked about how change happens when large numbers of people change the way they think a little bit. So that's what's present. Large numbers of people, not everyone, but quite a few, change in the way they think a little bit. Looking at it from the Northern California perspective, what happened was that the fires came in, and among all the things that they did is that they illuminated all of the cracks that were there before. They illuminated the issues around immigration. They illuminated the wealth disparity. They illuminated the racial disparity. They illuminated the growing problem of homelessness and the prices of housing in California. There was one one expression that came out almost immediately after the fires was, why are we so concerned about the people who became homeless on October 9th when we weren't concerned at all about the people who were homeless on October 8th? So that's, all of this stuff that's there becomes more visible. And there's this relentless push to get back to the old normal, even if we didn't like it. For some, it's this economic opportunity. Okay, we're going to get in there, we're going to rebuild, we're going to grab that land that's been burned off or whatever, and we're going to do what needs to be done, and we're going to make some good money doing it. But it's like it's really hard to have a new vision connected with that. It really isn't the time for most people to think about, would I be better off with a compost toilet? Would I be better off if I put in solar? It's just, God, I want back what I had. At least I knew what to complain about. And so it's this interesting disaster. It's like, as we've talked about it and thought about it, it ends up being this really challenging thing. On the one hand, what's gotten clear the more we've talked with people in California is that there's certain things that have got to be done. Like we actually need to familiarize and normalize a different set of behaviors, because guess what? This is a time of disasters. And in our framing at New Stories, when we talk about disasters, it includes the climate disasters, the hurricanes, the earthquakes, the tsunamis, forest fires. It also includes the social disasters, opioid epidemics, disrespectful treatment of women by men, growing gaps and disparities in terms of different who has access to what in the culture. Those are all disasters, and the personal disasters. I was fired, my spouse left, I left. All of them. The climate, the social, the personal. They're all different, and they're all disasters. They're all these disruptions of right now, and this invitation to either move in a different direction or to hunker down. And when we're talking about the climate disasters, which are the ones that are, sort of most overwhelming in some ways, or most prevalent, it's pretty clear that there's three kinds of work that are needed. One is the work to do better work preparing people for disaster. And when I talk about familiarizing and normalizing, it's like we really actually, we're at the point where it ought to be normal to have a go bag in your cloak closet by the front door. It ought to be normal to have at least a week's supply of water. It ought to be normal to know where your flashlight is, and on and on and on. There's just some things that need to be part of this new normal. And we, of course I've got a go bag. No big deal. And then there's the work that we've got to get better at in terms of the systems that after disaster hits, that help those who are most displaced, discomforted, disrupted, to find their feet and to be able to move ahead. And so really concentrating on what those systems need to be. And then there's the third area, and it's the area of what we should be doing just because it's the right thing to be doing anyway. One of the frameworks that New Stories started working with after, actually it came from an unsuccessful submittal to Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for a disaster and resilience project. But it doesn't matter that it was unsuccessful in many ways, because there was great learning and great teaching in the project itself. And the framework that we ended up stepping into is one of saying, look, we actually exist in a time of chronic stress. Just about everyone is overloaded, overwhelmed, stretched to the max. And it's particularly true for those whose lives are more at the margins, those who don't have anywhere near enough income, those who are pushed to the side because of who they are, how they look, how they feel, how they show up in the world. So we got the chronic stress, and we've got the greater incidence of chronic stress amongst those most challenged, most othered, most separated. And then what happens? What happens is another provocation comes along. There's a mass murder in the town next door. There's a forest fire that starts in the north. There's the smoke from that forest fire in the north that comes in. Those acute stresses land on this foundation of chronic stress, which is a pretty shaky, crumbly foundation. And then it blows up one way or another. What's missing as we move in this time of chronic stress is it's chasing out the sense of belonging. It's chasing out social inclusion. It's chasing us apart because we just don't have any time. And especially, we don't have any time if we're raising three kids as a single mom and working 2 jobs. So the question becomes, for me, this combination of what's the work that we need to do right now, and how do we do that work in a way that builds social cohesion. Give an example. You know, in Napa, in Napa, one of the things that happened was that after the fires, actually in Sonoma, excuse me, after the fires in October, there was one person who said, "Crap, people need stuff. You know, people who've been displaced, they've lost everything, and they need stuff. They need everything from water to food to a microwave. I'm going to open my home. I'm going to go out. I'm going to start finding stuff and bringing it into my home, open my home so that people can come and get whatever I have that they need and sit around and share a story with each other, talk about their experience, grieve, share hope, get what they need and leave." About the same time as I was hearing that story, I was hearing a story from another community where they said, "You know, we finally figured out how to handle this whole business of emergency supplies after disaster. And what we've landed on is we're going to do a drive-through and have the drive-through set up. People are going to come in, they're going to pop their trunk, we're going to slam the carton or the case of supplies into the back of their trunk, shut the trunk, and they're going to go off." And, you know, I looked at those two, and both have the same intent. One, you know, there's challenges with both of them, but I asked myself the question, which of these two approaches actually builds community? Which of these two approaches actually helps people connect with each other again? And of course, the answer to that's obvious. So it becomes a question for me of what's the work that we need to do, and how do we do it in a way that begins to build a fabric of connection again? How do we do it? How do we do the stuff that we need to do in a way that calls us into community again? And the good news is that we're already doing it. You know, Chris Gilmore, who's a News Stories and Transition US and Post Carbon Institute and Shareable, have been doing a action learning cohort called Stories into Action. And we pulled together a group of about 20 people who have been meeting periodically on Zoom to talk about the same thread. What's the work that we're called to do in our community, and how do we do it in a way that builds social cohesion? And Chris is one of those people. And one of the things that we talked about on one of our last calls is something that News Stories is calling in, and it's what we've called the Preparing for the Possible Network. I continue to have this ongoing dance with disaster. And when I was doing my work in Japan, I had this real resistance as being identified as the disaster guy. When AfterNow came out in the fall of last year, and when the fires hit in California, I sort of blew past that because it's like obvious that that's one of the predominant characteristics of the era that we're alive in right now. Is it's a disaster. We're alive in a disaster. In fact, on a call yesterday, I was saying to someone, it's like it feels like we've actually moved beyond Joanna Macy's framing of the great turning and the great unraveling, and that we're actually in the time of the great passing, and that what's been before is passing, and that happens to be the time that we're alive in right now. What do we do? What do we do in the time of the great passing? The fact is, we already know what to do in the time of the great passing, and the preparing for the possible before and after disaster it's the theme, and it's a looking for what the questions are, and it's looking for what the stories are. So the aspiration, and looking at the clock, it looks like this is what we're going to maybe end with and be able to go into more the next time we do this in 2 weeks, is what we know is that a lot of people are already doing things that make a difference in their own communities. We also know that much of that work has a good, sometimes powerful, local impact, and that it stops there because it's invisible, because nobody else knows about it. So part of what we want to do with the Preparing for the Possible Network is to begin to surface those stories of what people are doing that are working. What have you found? How'd you find it? What's going on? What are the results that you're getting? We want to start curating those. We want to start bringing those forward in a way that, on the one hand, reflects back to the people doing this work, perhaps some of you on this Facebook Live, that reflects back to the people who are doing this work, that keep on. This is important. This makes sense. And to make it visible outside, to make it visible as an invitation to others that says, take a look at this. And you don't have to try and do exactly what they're doing, but what does this inspire in you? How does it make you look at what you've been doing in a different way? What's the invitation here? And so first aspect of Preparing for the Possible Network is to begin to curate those stories, to curate those experiences and make them visible. And we're seeing this network basically as stretching from Northern California up through the Northwest and into Alberta. So it's a pretty wide swing, you know, and it is a region where wildfires are one of the powerful, overwhelming disasters right now. So first aspect of Preparing for the Possible Network is to curate those stories and experiences. Second aspect is to look at that body of work, that body of life, and to say, what helps to connect this? What's the narrative that's here? What's the story that's here? What are the other perspectives, the other insights, which, if brought into this network, would make the individual work of people even more powerful? So what do we need to create? What else, if created, makes the work that we're doing individually in our different communities even more powerful? So curate and create. Last piece, we know, and this is the core of our work at New Stories, we know that good stuff happens when people are brought together in contexts where they listen to each other, where they're curious about each other, where they begin to create together with each other. So one of the ways that we think of ourselves is that we're conveners. We work with partners to create and convene gatherings that make a difference. And we see the other aspect of Preparing for the Possible Network being one of convening and supporting people in convening the conversations that matter as we find our way into that invisible future. We said we're going to keep these to 30 minutes. This is all an experiment. Love to hear from any of you who are watching now or who watch later. What was good in this, what you would like more of, what you would have liked less of. We're going to start this as a regular weekly, with exceptions, a live event, Tuesday, 3 o'clock on Facebook Live, starting on the 31st of July, so 2 weeks from now. Love to hear from you. Love to know what you thought of this. Help us improve it. This is part of preparing for the possible network. We really want to bring people together and begin sharing what we know and what we've seen. It's kind of weird for me to be just staring into a camera for a half hour. I do my best work when I'm listening to people and talking with people. So I'm adapting to this medium, and I'm delighted to have been able to share this time with you. Go well, and perhaps see you back on the 31st of July at 3 p.m. And in the meantime, have a look at www.afternow.today, which is the website for the AfterNow book with lots of resources on it, and at our home site, www.newstories.org. Be well.